Before we start, don't forget to like this video and subscribe if you haven't already. It's completely free and it supports me enormously. Share this video with your friends and family. Spread the word. If you're a real fan, a big thank you to you. The wind blew differently that day. On the eve of a quiet evening, the sand began to rise, swirling in spirals through the air like a strange, uninterrupted dance. The palm trees, which had long withstood the desert gusts, were beginning to bend under the pressure. The day's heat, though persistent, suddenly seemed heavy and oppressive. There were no clouds, but a palpable tension was felt in the atmosphere. The people of Kandala had grown accustomed to desert winds, but this one was different. It seemed to have a purpose, a force both profound and menacing. It moved through the dunes with a whisper like a soft, almost familiar voice. Yet it was neither soothing nor comforting. It carried with it an eerie sensation, a premonition that something unusual was about to happen. The older ones, especially Bahir, began to carefully observe the wind's movements. There was no doubt in his mind. This was no ordinary wind. It was a warning. But the others, younger and imbued with the idea that Kandala was invincible, dismissed it as a mere breeze. They could not have known that this wind would soon change everything. The next morning, the villagers awoke to a heavy sky, a veil of dust covering the horizon. As the heat of the day set in, strange shapes began to appear in the sand around the sacred well. Snakes made of sand, glistening and sinuous, slithered slowly across the ground, their bodies undulating like waves of water in a mirage. Each movement seemed controlled, almost choreographed, and their tracks left no imprints. At first, the villagers watched them warily, thinking they were an illusion created by the wind. But the more the sand snakes wound around the well, the more it became clear that they were not simply natural phenomena. Their appearance seemed to herald something more sinister. The elders, especially Bahir, began to murmur prayers and gather around the well, their faces grave. They recognized the snakes as a sign from the desert spirits, a warning that nature was demanding balance. Yet despite the obvious signs, many villagers remained skeptical. Makani, the influential merchant, denied any spiritual interpretation, insisting that these snakes were simply a normal phenomenon. Their presence persisted, however, a silent threat slowly weaving itself around Kandala's prosperity. The sand snakes continued to wind around the sacred well, and with their presence, a sense of unease intensified among the people of Kandala. Although some tried to downplay this strange phenomenon, a growing sense of foreboding gripped the most sensitive, those who felt the deep connection between earth and air. Amina, always in tune with the whispers of the desert, watched the sand snakes with growing concern. She had seen similar signs in the ancient legends of her people, warnings from nature that humanity had ignored at its peril. She wasn't the only one feeling this anxiety. Shivers ran through the younger generation, and the field workers found themselves unable to continue their tasks under the pressure of the heavy atmosphere. Even the animals seemed disturbed, their behavior becoming increasingly nervous. But despite everything, the most influential, like Makani, continued to dismiss these signs as superstition. Their optimism blinded them to the impending danger. Makani continued to reassure the village, insisting that everything would eventually return to normal. Yet every breath of wind, every movement of the sand snakes, seemed to whisper that the time for respite was over. The village elders gathered in a circle under the shade of the palm trees, their faces marked by years and experience. Bahir, the most respected among them, opened the discussion in a deep voice, turning to the young and less wise who had come to listen. "The desert is not a simple expanse of sand," he said, looking at the dunes in the distance. "It is a living, ancient being whose balance must be respected." The appearances of the sand snakes were a sign, a warning, and the elders knew that this kind of phenomenon was not trivial. Bahir recalled the stories from his childhood, told by his ancestors about the pacts between the inhabitants of Kandala and the spirits of the desert. Pacts of respect and harmony that maintained the balance, ensuring that the sacred well would never dry up and that the village would prosper. "You must listen," he insisted. "The sand snakes are not here by chance. They are messengers of the spirits, witnesses to a betrayal. However, despite the wisdom evident in his words, many of the villagers, young and influenced by Makani, remained skeptical. To them, the ancient legends were tales of the past, and the modern world no longer needed such beliefs. They walked away from the meeting, leaving the elders alone with their growing fears. The legends of the elders were filled with stories of sacred pacts between the inhabitants of Kandala and the spirits of the desert. These agreements had been established generations ago, when the village was still young and the land was a place of purity. At that time, the villagers respected nature's rituals, offering symbolic sacrifices to maintain balance and honor the spirits. The sacred well, which never dried up, was the reward for this commitment to the desert. Bahir remembered the old songs his grandfather used to sing to him, words filled with wisdom. The water from the well is not a gift, but a loan that the desert can take back at any moment. These words echoed painfully in his mind as he watched the village youth, who no longer had time for ancient rites. They lived under the illusion that Kandala's wealth would last forever, but they had forgotten that everything, even prosperity, must be nurtured by respect for the land and its spirits. Bahir stood slowly and, with a gesture, invited the other elders to join him. Together they walked to the sacred well where it all began, hoping that their call to ancient wisdom would not be forgotten. Despite the elders' warnings, a large part of the villagers, led by Makani, remained steadfast in their refusal to revive forgotten traditions. To them, ancient rituals were nothing more than baseless superstitions, beliefs from a bygone era that no longer had a place in a modern world where prosperity was the product of human ingenuity and not unseen forces. The desert is a land of labor, not mysticism, Makani asserted with conviction at village gatherings. The well is the fruit of our efforts, not the favor of the spirits. These words resonated strongly among those who prospered from exploiting the desert's resources, but they left the elders in silent sadness. They knew that nature could not be ignored without consequence. Despite growing murmurs, Makani managed to convince the majority of the inhabitants to turn away from ancestral practices, convinced that abandoning these rituals would change nothing for their future. But a deep unease was forming, a feeling that the village, strong in its material wealth, was moving dangerously far away from what had allowed its prosperity, respect for and balance with nature. The wisdom of the elders, precious as it was, seemed to be losing ground to the arrogance of human pride. Makani stood firm in his convictions. Faced with the growing signs of the desert, such as sand snakes and the whisperings of the wind, he did not waver. "These are natural phenomena," he repeated constantly. "There is nothing to fear." For him, Kandala's prosperity was not the result of luck, but of logic, hard work, and management. These signs were merely coincidences, illusions created by fear. Despite the elders' growing concerns, Makani deeply believed in his pragmatic approach and in the resilience of his people. He considered ancient rituals useless relics, superstitions propagated by ignorance. According to him, the village had succeeded thanks to its ingenuity and audacity, not through prayers or sacrifices. His sure and reassuring speech attracted more and more villagers. Those already influenced by his modern ideas drew closer to him, forming a group that openly rejected the old warnings. For them, there was no reason to return to the old ways. They believed the village had the power to govern itself, and that nature, even the desert, would only accept their domination. But as the wind blew stronger, a dull disquiet crept into the air. As the days passed, Makani's influence over the people of Kandala grew steadily. His charisma, confidence, and pragmatism made him a leading figure in the village. His speeches on work, effort, and the science of agriculture appealed to many. For him, Kandala's prosperity came not from a desert spirit, but from human ingenuity and mastery, natural resources. The villagers, although traditionally respectful of their elders, were beginning to doubt themselves. Why listen to warnings from a bygone era when modern life seemed to offer more tangible solutions? Makani promised them a secure future, based on logic and action, not on mystical beliefs and uncertain rituals. Gradually, his followers grew in number. They vigorously supported his point of view, even deriding the elders as old conservatives stuck in the past. Bahir and the other wise men found themselves isolated, their voices drowned out by the tide of a newfound faith in material prosperity. Signs of the desert, such as the sand snakes, were now interpreted as mere natural phenomena, unrelated to any warning. Makani had succeeded in instilling blind faith in human logic, eclipsing any notion of respect for the invisible forces that govern nature. As Makani's popularity grew, a rift slowly opened up within the Kandala community. Makani's followers, convinced that prosperity should be guided by science and progress, drew closer to him, forming an increasingly powerful and influential group. Their support for Makani's vision was unwavering, and they scoffed at the warnings of the elders, seeing them as useless relics of a bygone era. These villagers firmly believed that Kandala's future lay in the continued exploitation of resources, without having to worry about superstitions or ancient balances. However, in the shadow of this certainty, a growing group of villagers began to doubt. The elders, though isolated, remained a beacon of wisdom, and their warnings still resonated in more open minds. Amina, one of the younger inhabitants of the village, began to ask questions. If we have prospered through harmony with the desert, why does that prosperity now seem threatened? She wondered secretly. Tensions rose, murmurs of concern circulated, and soon the entire village existed in a precarious balance. On one side, the blind certainty of human logic, on the other, an ancient wisdom that many were afraid to question. The first sand snakes appeared at dawn, slithering silently across the arid ground around the sacred well. Their undulating forms made of fine, shimmering sand seemed strange and almost otherworldly. As they moved, their bodies twisted and intertwined, forming intricate patterns on the ground. Some villagers, drawn by this phenomenon, advanced cautiously, their eyes fixed on these mysterious creatures. At first, they believe it to be a simple natural curiosity, an illusion produced by the wind and the heat. But as the snakes multiply, their presence becomes more disturbing. The patterns they create seem almost meaningful, like a ritual dance, with perfect synchronization between the creatures. Each movement seems charged with a supernatural energy, as if the desert itself is responding to an invisible force. The elders, for their part, watch in silence, a glimmer of recognition and concern in their eyes. Bahir the wise man murmurs unintelligible words as if remembering an ancient prophecy. This phenomenon, though magnificent in its strangeness, was a sign, a warning. Nature, he believed, was reclaiming its rightful place. The sand snakes were not simply creatures, but messengers of the desert. As the sand snakes stir around the well, a strange disturbance fills the atmosphere. The wind grows stronger, blowing in unexpected gusts that stir up swirls of sand. The air seems to grow heavier, as if each grain of dust carries an invisible weight. The birds fall silent, and an eerie silence falls over the village, as if the entire world is holding its breath. The vibrations of the ground become perceptible. With each movement of the snakes, an invisible wave crosses the desert, disrupting the natural balance of the region. Plants, usually resistant to the harsh climate, begin to wither rapidly, their leaves yellowing and falling. Rumors spread among the locals. Several wells, once abundant, are beginning to dry up, and some young animals are falling ill for no apparent reason. The village elders, usually implacable in the face of nature's challenges, begin to look at each other with concern. Bahir remembers the stories of his ancestors who spoke of these signs as impending misfortune. But Makani, true to his belief in human self-sufficiency, brushes aside these fears. He turns to the crowd, assuring them that all this is simply the whim of the desert, and that the situation will return to normal with a little work and perseverance. Yet, a slight anxiety lingers in the heavy air. The elders, though discreet, begin to meet in secret, exchanging worried glances and whispers. Bahir, in particular, feels a heavy weight settle on his heart. He recalls the ancient legends told by his ancestors, those that spoke of sand snakes as messengers of the desert spirits. creatures sent to restore balance when it was disturbed. The signs were clear. Nature was angry, and the imbalance caused by the villagers' arrogance only fueled this anger. But most of the locals remained skeptical, and even some of the older ones are beginning to doubt themselves. The reality of a spiritual warning seems absurd to them. Their minds are filled with more mundane, more rational thoughts, and they have neither the time nor the inclination to believe in unseen forces. The group led by McCaney vigorously rejects these ideas, convinced that the snakes are simply a natural curiosity and that prosperity will return with additional effort. Yet, the voices of Bahir and the other wise men begin to grow more urgent. They pray silently, invoking the spirits of the desert in the hope of preventing impending misfortune. The wind picks up, blowing harder as if the desert were answering their call. As night falls, the wind begins to pick up, gently at first, like a light breath in the dry desert air. But soon it grows louder, and the inhabitants of Kandala begin to hear whispers that seem to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. These are not natural sounds like the usual whirring of the wind. No, these voices whisper indistinct words as if carrying ancient secrets long kept hidden by the desert. The villagers gather in their homes, perplexed and fearful. Some whisper that these are the spirits of the desert manifesting themselves, while others, younger and less inclined to believe in legends, attribute it to hallucinations caused by the heat. Yet, as the hours pass, the whispers become louder, carried by the wind. They seem to slip into every crack in the walls, fill every corner, brush against the ears of the inhabitants like invisible but palpable presences. The voices never utter clear words, but their intonations are undeniably menacing. The inhabitants of Kandala wake with a start, trembling with the sensation that something is awakening in the desert, a warning many still don't know how to interpret. The wind, carrying these whispers, seems to whisper threats they cannot ignore. As the nights pass, the whispers of the wind intensify, and the tension among the inhabitants of Kandala becomes palpable. Each night, more and more villagers awaken with a start, their hearts pounding, some convinced they have heard voices calling them, others certain they have heard clear warnings, but none can grasp their meaning. Those who previously refused to believe in the legends of the desert begin to doubt, wondering if what they hear is not actually a sign from the spirits. Makani's once convincing speeches begin to lose their impact. While he insists that these noises are simply the result of natural phenomena, like the echoes of the wind, a few voices among the villagers rise to express their concern. "The wind doesn't blow like that," says Amina, a young woman who has always believed the warnings of the elders. "There is something greater behind all this, something we don't understand." The elders, though worried, find no clear answers either. Bahir, tired, barely whispers, "The desert speaks to us, but we are too arrogant to listen." Doubt sets in, sowing division among the villagers who now wonder if the elders' wisdom could be right after all. The whispers of the wind take on a new dimension as the days pass. What seemed like a simple whim of nature becomes increasingly ominous. Some villagers begin to hear distinct words carried by the gusts of sand. Clear warnings escape from the wind's breath. The time has come. The balance is broken. You cannot flee. These words resonate like an echo, repeated almost hypnotically, forcing their way into the minds of those who dare to listen. The signs become inevitable. The ground trembles slightly underfoot, a shudder running through the earth like a warning. The wells continue to dry up, and the heat becomes unbearable. The wind no longer brings the freshness of dawn, but a heavy, stifling heat, as if the desert itself were trying to assert itself. A part of the village, the one that had until now refused to admit the truth, begins to be overwhelmed by anxiety. But here his tormented soul recalls the ancient, forgotten rituals. "The desert never forgets," he says, his eyes full of sadness. Fear gradually takes hold of the villagers. The echo of the desert is now impossible.